What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carry inside. Mostly saying hooray for our side. These battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. This is a very special edition for me because I get to interview my friend, Laura Friedman, who is a state assembly member from California's 43rd district. How you doing, Laura?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. I thought I'd start by asking how you and your family are doing with this new normal of staying inside.
Well, it's a very bizarre time and a challenging time for everybody. I think we're all anxious, we're all worried, and we've been doing our best to try to keep ourselves healthy and to work from home. My husband and I are both trying to work from home, and we have a 6-year-old. So trying to keep the 6-year-old entertained while I'm making phone calls all day has been very challenging. And today we got our Chromebook from our schools here in Glendale, and it took me about an hour and a half to try to set up her Chromebook. And tomorrow, and we'll start kind of easing her into home education, which will also be a challenge. So we're doing well, but it's all, it's not what we were expecting to be doing a few months ago. Let's put it that way. I feel like the hardest thing has really been for my daughter, and my heart kind of breaks for her. She was in this after-school program called Rockstar. It's an enrichment program, and she's been so excited about performing Sunday Girl by Blondie. And she's still been rehearsing it, and my heart just breaks knowing that she's not going to be going back and doing Sunday Girl in school. She's not going to be going back to school at all this year, most likely. And I don't think she quite understands that at 6.
Yeah, I'm sure it must be very hard. I don't envy you, quite frankly, being in that situation because you're trying to work also from home. And as we were discussing before we started the show, this is really giving our husbands an opportunity to step up and see how well they do what we've been doing for decades, if not generations, juggling both work and home. So my next question is about what's happening in your district. I was looking at statistics yesterday, and of course they change every day, but I read that Glendale, which is the main city that you represent along with Burbank, had 36 corona cases as of yesterday, and that was the 5th largest number in the county. So I wanted to ask you how your district is holding up. I also looked at the map, and it seems like there's 2 hospitals in Burbank, 2 in Glendale. Have you checked up on them? How are they handling the corona cases? Do they have enough equipment and protective gear?
So I've been spending every day reaching out to all of the stakeholders across the district. So in my district, I have Providence St. Joseph in Burbank. I have Glendale Memorial, Glendale Adventist, and Verdugo Hills Hospital, which is a USC hospital up in the top part of the district, the top of Glendale and La Cañada. And I also have the Kaiser facility on Sunset, the big Kaiser facility. And of course, a lot of clinics. And so I've been speaking to them, and they're all worried. I mean, quite honestly, they're worried. They feel that they have the capacity to handle the crisis right now. And if we do flatten the curve and buy them enough time so that the medical devices that are coming into the state and the PPEs, the protective protection equipment for their workers comes in, they'll be okay. The problem is if we have a huge spike in critical cases that come into the emergency room over the next 3-4 days that overwhelm them. So they're guardedly okay. I will say that we don't have enough PPEs just statewide, and we don't have them across the country. Not just the frontline medical professionals who don't have the PPEs they need. The nurses don't have them, the doctors don't have them, but people that are working in nursing homes don't have them. We have people who are working in grocery stores handling food who don't have PPEs, who want it for their own protection, but also for their customers' protection. So this is really challenging for everybody. And we hear about the PPEs more than anything else with the stakeholders. When we talk to the homeless providers, they're feeling pretty good about shelter space. They're feeling pretty good about their ability to get people into beds right now compared to where they were a few months ago. Their big concern is a lot of the PPEs for their frontline workers. For them to have to send people on the streets as ambassadors to talk to homeless people without masks and gloves and other protective devices is a really scary thing for them to ask people to do.
Yeah. Now, what do you think about the fact that, we're able to get things done in this kind of crisis that we're not able to get done under normal situations, when certain people are always in a situation of crisis, like the homeless? I mean, the mayor was just talking about in his press conference a little while ago that they have all the recreation centers now housing the homeless. Now, all the homeless obviously are still not off the streets, but it's a far better cry than before this crisis. And we also saw the federal government come up with a $2.2 trillion bailout package, in addition to another $4.6 trillion that is going free money basically to banks and corporations and private equity firms. Nobody was asking what they always ask Bernie Sanders: how are you going to pay for it? Suddenly they found the money to pay for it. Do you see your communities utilizing this situation to create some changes? In other words, to turn lemons into lemonade?
That's a great question. And I think only time will tell whether any of this really sticks. One of the concerns I have is it's great to be putting homeless people in hotels, but at the end of the crisis, and this will end, what do you do then? Do you say to them, well, I hope that you enjoyed your hotel, now back out on the streets for all of you? Where we put our investments is a signal of our priorities, but also it's very telling about our values. And our values in this country for the past several years, increasingly under this administration, but for many years, has really been to defund housing and urban development funds, programs that go to keep roofs over people's head, to help people who are bottom rung of the socioeconomic ladder. At the same time, we heavily subsidize corporate interests. We subsidize even single family homeowners with the way that we do tax incentives. And it's not that any of that is necessarily bad, but what is bad is that we don't prioritize lifting all boats and making sure that we have a roof over everybody's head in this country, which really should be one of our top priorities, and that everybody has access to quality health care, which is something else that this country has resisted quite a bit. So I do hope that we come out of this understanding why housing people is not just for them, it's a societal good. It's something that benefits everybody. I mean, we could have an entire show where we just talk about homelessness and what California and Los Angeles's response has been to homelessness. It's a difficult situation. It takes a lot of parsing out of all of the different efforts that have been done. But I do think that if there's some silver lining, that we're turbocharging right now our efforts to get people off the streets. And I hope that we also find a way to make that permanent and not make that a temporary situation. And I'm not saying make it permanent that people are staying in rec centers. I mean, make it permanent that we find permanent housing for people that's sustainable.
Right. Okay, so now let's talk about the state legislature, because I hadn't heard much from them, and I wasn't even sure if they were meeting. I didn't even realize until 2 days ago when I got an email from Catherine Phillips from the Sierra Club that they are not meeting. So this is strange to me, since the city councils seem to be meeting telephonically and on Zoom, and they're handling public comments and everything. Why is the California Legislature not meeting, and do you plan to resume soon?
That's a good question. And I don't completely know the answer to the second part of when we're going to resume being in session. So our last meeting was a week and a half ago. I was up in Sacramento, I believe a week and a half ago. On Monday, we had a very long session from 1 p.m. till 8:30 at night, where we appropriated $2 billion to go to the governor for emergency response to COVID, and worked on a whole bunch of other things that we could do to really get the response moving. And then we adjourned. Now, just us not being in session and not having our normal committee meetings and not being in Sacramento doesn't mean that we're not working. We are working quite a bit. And in fact, before I was on this call, I was on a Zoom conference with the Jewish caucus to talk about issues that we have with the work that we're doing. I have talks every day with my colleagues. I'm on the phone every day with stakeholders and constituents all day long. I've been talking to the speaker pretty much every day. We have conference calls with the Democratic caucus twice a week that are very long conference calls, et cetera. We had a call on Monday, I believe, with Gavin Newsom and Eric Garcetti and a bunch of the LA elected officials, the Board of Supervisors, a lot of the other elected officials and legislature members as well. The question as to why we're not meeting, it really comes down to there being some uncertainty as to what we can do in terms of waiving some of our procedures. Because unlike with the LA City Council, we have a lot of sort of constitutionally mandated procedures as to how we meet. So it's not in our charter the way it is with the city, it's in the California Constitution. So we have attorneys in the legislature who look at that and interpret it. And the worry is that if we continue to meet and continue to have our meetings remotely, that we lack a lot of the type of public participation and transparency that we normally have when we're in Sacramento, that it's much harder for stakeholders to see what we're doing and to be able to weigh in. How do you have public commentary about huge statewide issues if you're doing it remotely? And I'm not saying it's insurmountable. I think that people are just trying to make sure that it happens. So well,
let me just butt in here. I can tell you how it's happening with the city council, and they're doing these telephonic meetings. You actually can do it the way that I, as a reporter, can ask a question of Eric Garcetti. They give you a phone line, they give you a password, you sign in, and then the person will call on you and you ask your question. That we're not having all the crackpots make the statements anymore, that they get up and they pontificate for 1 or 2 minutes. The usual.
We call those members of the public, Lauren, members of the public.
So it's actually been working out better, and more efficiently. So technologically, it can be done because it is being done. So
yeah, I think it can be done. I think that there is some nervousness about the way that we operate is actually called out in the California Constitution. So unlike with the city of LA and the other cities. So I think there's some nervousness, but that said, I think that it could very well come to a place where if this doesn't kind of resume shortly, where we could go there. We're supposed to be back in session April 13th. So they were basically saying, let's pause until April 13th, plan on everyone coming back then, and we still have enough time to resume and do what we need to do. If by April 13th, this is not to the point where people feel safe coming up to the legislature, I think there's a very good possibility that we'll start having those kinds of remote meetings.
So I gather from what you just said that the committees are not meeting, like the Transportation Committee or the Housing. Has there been any special committees set up to deal with the coronavirus, or is that all happening on an ad hoc basis through these phone calls that you're talking about?
So I would say two things. First of all, the committees are basically being used right now for COVID response under the umbrella of the expertise of that committee. So transportation has become sort of transportation in the COVID age. So how do you continue to provide public transportation, get people where they need to go, deal with issues like we had a city today that was worried about losing SB1 funding because they can't meet deadlines right now because their staff isn't working. So my committee, which is natural resources, is still thinking about things like, are we making sure that we're still doing solid waste pickup during COVID in a way that's safe for those workers? What about wildfire as we move into wildfire season? I'll give you an issue that came up that I was talking to my committee about today. There's a worry now about scheduled blackouts to do very needed fire safety repair work in the wildlife interface zones, for instance, in the Edison territory. So what Edison was planning to do before COVID was to do scheduled power downs during the day to do those necessary repairs before fire season starts. But now, because everybody's working from home, the question is there a better way to do this, or a way that's not so disruptive to a workforce that's now working for their home, so you're not cutting people's power off in the middle of the day? So my committee has turned its attention to things that we think are still essential to try to do this year, but also to how COVID impacts the work that we're doing. So the health committee has been working on all of the issues that you can imagine, those necessary issues having to do with health and protecting our frontline health workers during COVID. I've been talking to my staff about trying to continue to work on some of the stuff that I've done in the past with our nursing homes and senior centers, and they're having tremendous difficulties because of COVID. So working on that. So all of our committees are still working, but they're pivoting right now to kind of pandemic response within their areas of expertise. So they are still working. They're not meeting, but they're working. And when we have our biweekly conference calls with the Democratic caucus and the speaker, the committee chairs in every area give very comprehensive updates about what they've learned about what they need to do for COVID. The insurance committee, for instance, is trying to deal with issues where businesses are having their claims denied for business interruptions because their insurance carriers are saying that COVID and pandemic is not a interrupted business reason that they should be, that would trigger them paying insurance for businesses. So the insurance committee is pivoting to spend time looking at that. So there's a lot of issues that those very professional staff in the committees are working on dealing with COVID.
Okay, well, there's a couple of bills, coincidentally enough, they're both by Scott Wiener, that I was planning to come out, one very strong for and one very strong against. And I was just wondering if you knew the status of them. Are they on hold? Scott Wiener had a bill, I think it's SB 971, which was for public power because of our concern about PG&E and how they've mishandled it. And now we were saying that the mood is right for finally having publicly owned power. That bill, and then also with the last failure of SB 50, he's got another one. This is like the zombie bill that will never die. He's going to die. He's going to go down fighting for this bill. Do you know the status of either of those two?
Well, when we all went on into recess and the Senate and the Assembly recessed on the same day a week and a half ago, because committees are not hearing bills, that also means the Rules Committee can't refer bills. So you can still amend your bill, the bills could have been introduced. If they have bill numbers, they've been introduced, but without committees hearing them, they're not moving forward at the moment. And I think what will end up happening is that the committee chairs will prioritize bills that they think are most important to get through this year, but we're not going to have the normal bill load that we normally have because we're not going to have the capacity having missed this time. And also because we really have to pivot to dealing with the immediate response to the pandemic. So my guess is that 20% of the bills that were introduced make it through, maybe less. And some of the bills might be gutted and amended into bills that are more germane to what's happening right now. And I couldn't tell you about those two bills until the committees start meeting again. Nothing's happening with them. Until they start moving through the process, they're just in a holding pattern like all of the other bills.
Okay. How do you think Gavin Newsom has been dealing with this crisis? Are there any things that you think he shouldn't have done, things that you would like to see him do?
I think he's doing well, but like most people, I'm, watching this as it unfolds day to day. And I'm certainly no expert in pandemic response. I'm learning about this like everybody else is day to day. I feel lucky that he's our leader compared to what I see in leadership in some other states. From the beginning, he's taken it seriously. He's put a lot of resources into it. He seems to be spending, all of his time trying to get resources into California, making sure that he does what he needs to do with President Trump so that we get resources. And that's got to be tough for him to do just personally, I would think. He's been very good about fielding questions from the legislature. Tomorrow, when we have our call, for instance, Anthony Williams, who's one of his chiefs, is going to be on the call to answer our questions. We've been sending questions in for the last few days. The governor's office has been responsive. I brought something up about LASA, which is our, LA County homeless provider. They were having issues wanting a grant that was they had applied for that was stuck up in kind of bureaucrat land. It's supposed to come through in the next few months. I brought it up to the governor on the conference call, I think yesterday, and he just said, you get me that grant number and we will get that money, shook loose right away so that LASA, the homeless provider, has what they need. And I that's what we need. We really need the funding to go to the right places. We need the oversight, but we need to make sure that there's central organization in a state this big. We're a giant state. And when you've got every hospital saying they need PPEs, and you've got every first responder wanting masks, and you've got the public trying to make masks in their garage, there needs to be a very organized, good central place to deal with all of that. There needs to be, Cal OES is really stepping up to get information out to people, to organize, to make sure that that getting the PPEs prioritized into the right places is happening. And that's what I'm looking for right now from leadership. What I'm looking for is making sure that there are no gaps, that every part of the state gets exactly what they need, not more, but not less. And I do think that the governor is trying to focus every agency on doing that.
Well, I'll tell you, somebody sent me an anonymous tip. I mean, I know who the person is, but the person asked to remain anonymous for fear of reprisal. And this is a Veterans Affairs hospital in Palo Alto, where they are being told in their unit not to wear masks, not to bring masks, not to have them at all. And they are very concerned that this is going to be harmful for themselves and their vulnerable patients. And I just read a ProPublica report that they're not alone. This is also a problem in a VA hospital in Albuquerque. Now, I tweeted the governor, Kamala Harris, Dianne Feinstein, Ro Khanna, who's the congressman there, the head of the VA, the head of the Veterans Affairs Committee in the Senate and the House, and the ranking member, and no response.
So it's interesting you bring this up, because I had this come up as well today or yesterday from a constituent who, and I'm just looking for this text I just sent, from a constituent whose husband works at a, at a nursing home. And same thing, the nursing home employees will want to wear masks for their own protection, but also for their clients, and they've been instructed not to. So first of all, as far as I know, and I could be wrong about this, that the VA is directly under VA and federal control, not state. So I'm not even sure that the state could impact VA policy if they wanted to. I believe VA is completely run by the VA, federal agency. But in terms of the PPEs, so I'm just going to read to you what my staff sent me when I asked this exact same question, if you'll just bear with me, if that's okay with you. So I had asked about employees being prohibited by their employers to wear masks. And what she wrote is that employees are not prohibited from wearing masks. However, facilities, healthcare facilities are following or should be following the CDC guidelines, which require PPEs when caring for someone with symptoms. However, the CDC itself is not currently recommending wearing PPEs, including masks, all of the time for two reasons. Number one, PPEs must be changed frequently to avoid cross-contamination. Otherwise, you can actually put people more at danger. And if you're wearing a mask and you touch your face with unwashed hands, you can contaminate the mask and then carry those germs with you to the next resident. And then using PPEs when it's not needed can result in a facility or individuals exhausting their very limited supply of materials. And if it's a homemade mask, the CDC recommends those as a last resort, because a lot of times those homemade masks actually don't offer very much virus protection, and people think they do. So they might say, well, I'm wearing this homemade mask, so even though maybe I'm sneezing or I'm dealing with someone that I think might have COVID, I've got my homemade mask on, so I'm okay, but they're actually not okay. So CDC may change that recommendation as we get more masks in. They may change that, but I can tell you, they are really, really short on masks, and they are trying to reserve those for our frontline medical personnel who are dealing with COVID positive people. And they're afraid that if people are using them when they really don't need to, they're not going to have enough for the people they really need them for. So I think part of it is that we have this huge shortage, because from my understanding is that when Trump did his tariff against China, medical supplies, including masks, were part of that. So they were not being imported. He didn't import them when we had a chance to import them before this worldwide crisis. And we are now bidding against the entire world for a very limited supply of them. And the federal government has also told the governors that they're not going to get involved, that the governors have to go out and procure their own PPEs, which means that all the states are bidding against each other for PPEs and against other countries. So masks that used to be a couple of cents a piece are now like $1 a piece.
This is capitalism, and this is neoliberalism, okay? Because this wasn't the case 40 years ago. I date the onset of neoliberalism with the year I graduated college, which was 1979, when all of a sudden we began to think that private entities could provide public goods and services better, cheaper, and more efficiently than public entities and governments. And right now, when you take healthcare and you make it for profit, which actually wasn't the case until Richard Nixon did a favor for his biggest donor, Edgar Kaiser, that was the start of the for-profit health, industry in the 70s. They do things based on profit and supply chains, and they're not going to keep like I'm going to do my show on Thursday night about Cuomo and how the very thing that he's complaining about is not enough hospitals is because of him shutting and consolidating hospitals for private benefit. So they only keep in stock what they need. They don't think about pandemics. And I wanted to ask you about the article that the LA Times did such excellent reporting on, which was how Arnold Schwarzenegger, our Republican governor, actually thought about this and had these mobile hospitals and stockpiled these very supplies that would be needed in a pandemic like this. And Jerry Brown actually stopped funding it and then started selling off the pieces when we were in a deficit. And then when we got back into a budget surplus, never started it up again. So what do you think of that?
Well, I'm sure that Jerry Brown we're thinking about that very thing himself. I mean, I wasn't around then. I think that we need to look, I've believed for a while that we should be listening to scientists. We should have been listening to the scientists when they warned us that a pandemic was not if, but when. I have been saying for a long time that we trust scientists to, JPL lands a rover on Mars within a foot of where they wanted to, but people don't want to believe them when it comes to global warming because it's, inconvenient and cuts into, people's what they want out of their life. But we need to start listening to scientists. And I think that this is a wake-up call, maybe, that we need to take pandemics seriously. We need to take global warming much more seriously because that's another looming crisis that's, maybe this is a bit of a dress rehearsal for. So, it's not like people haven't been warning about this for a long time. Bill Gates, one of our ultimate capitalists, had a giant TED Talk that was viewed like 10 million times where he warned about upcoming pandemics and how we need to be ready at the same time that the federal government here was dismantling the CDC and defunding it. We are an incredibly wealthy country and resource rich, and yet we don't make these very basic investments that would make us more resilient. We need to think of ourselves, we need to invest in resiliency. We're trying to do it in the state with wildfire, but certainly with healthcare, with pandemics, and with climate. And we should be listening to scientists more. Yeah.
Now, let's talk about budgets, because the state, unlike the federal budget, cannot print money. And, Trump is being accused of funneling more money and quicker money to his Republican governors than the Democratic ones.
The states he wants to win, by the way. You notice that one too?
Interesting. Yeah, well, he's a political animal, all right. Cuomo is complaining that out of the 2.2 trillion, New York is not getting enough. And of course, New York has many, many more cases than California. And I think started the staying at home policy a lot too late into the crisis. We started earlier. But do you think do you know how much money California is going to get yet? And do you think it's ample to meet our needs? And then a related question, California currently has an ample budget surplus and a rainy day fund. But my understanding is that most of these revenues are projected based on how businesses do and how much wealthy individuals make and then pay in taxes. And all of that is in question right now. So do you know what is projected to be coming in revenue-wise in the first 2 quarters and how that might change given that all these non-essential businesses are shutting down and people are losing their jobs?
We are going to be facing a huge financial crisis. We are now, and certainly a lot of our residents are because they're not working. Businesses are closing. People are losing their livelihoods. They could very well lose their homes, not be able to pay rent. I mean, this is one of the, really, really looming and scary things about this pandemic is the economic effects. And the effect on the state budget is going to be profound. I mean, we do now get a revenue from internet sales that we didn't used to get. We now do tax internet sales in California, and thank goodness for that, because that's some revenue that a few years ago we wouldn't have had at all. but we expect this to be, a huge financial hit at the very time we want to be pumping money back out to help people, to support people. Now, in terms of the federal bailout, $2 trillion is a lot of money, but the toll of COVID-19 on our infrastructure and on our economy is really unprecedented, and we don't exactly know what the real impact's going to be. Now, we're still assessing how much of that money is going to flow to California. We just don't know. One of our primary concerns is to get that money quickly, because we need to get that money out the door. It needs to come in and go back out. We can't wait months for this, because it's going to really hurt people. We need those funds to support our healthcare providers, our vulnerable older adults, our schools, our small businesses, and of course, everyone who's out of work right now. And being able to support people that are out of work is going to be key to keeping people in their homes, keeping their families fed. We expect to receive about $25 million to support home delivered meals for older adults and adults with disabilities. Out of the education funding in the federal package, we should be getting about 10%. That's $3 billion in emergency relief, $13 billion to stabilize our school systems, who are really being taxed by this, and about $8.8 billion to support our school nutrition programs. Some of my top concerns is making sure that the funds to support employment gets here quickly. The Federal CARE Act provides critical support to independent contractors and freelancers. These are people who have really had their job opportunities evaporate, and they're traditionally not able to get unemployment insurance because freelancers don't pay into unemployment insurance, so they can't get it now, a lot of them. And I've had tons of residents contacting me. My district has a lot of entertainment industry people. A lot of those people are freelancers who right now have had their incomes go to zero. A lot of them are probably not eligible for unemployment insurance. So making sure that we can get that money in and back out to them quickly is something that I'm very concerned about. Now, we have had, we're still assessing, and I don't exactly know what chunk California is going to get and where it's going to go. And we have a lot of people analyzing that right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, the biggest concern that I am hearing from everybody, just by word of mouth and also on social media, is that these eviction moratoria are not enough. That just not, or even not having to pay your rent on April 1st, as Eric Garcetti said. If this rent piles up and these mortgages pile up, if people aren't working, once they get their jobs back, they're still not going to be able to pay, no matter how long you extend these payments over. So there was an editorial in the San Francisco Chronicle, which I sent to you, which I thought had a great idea in it, which was rent freeze and a mortgage freeze. And I think the way that you could pay for this is say, well, when you pay a mortgage, a very good percentage of it is the interest payment, and not very much is the principal. In fact, in the beginning of the mortgage, most of it is interest.
Right.
We are giving the banks free money right now. That $4 to $6 trillion, in addition to the $2.2 trillion I mentioned to you, is zero interest money that we're giving to the banks. And we did this in the financial collapse also. So what they do is they take money at zero interest, and then they lend it to the Treasury for 2%, whatever money, and they make money on the spread, which is ridiculous. I think we should get rid of the Fed, and the Treasury Department should spend its own money, and they shouldn't have to pay for their own money. But that's a whole nother show. What I'm suggesting is these banks that we're giving all this interest-free money to, we should be telling them that they should not be charging interest on these mortgages. They should not charge interest on the credit card debt. The student loans should not be paying interest. I mean, I would like to see a complete student loan to forgive, to cancel all that student loan debt. I think it would be the biggest stimulus the economy has ever seen. But right now, I think we should be canceling the interest. Now, I don't know how much of this you guys can mandate on the state level,
Right.
but what do you think of that idea?
You've definitely given this a lot of thought. So we got a white paper a few days ago from the banking committee in the assembly that's been looking at a lot of this. And you're absolutely right that the ability for California to dictate to the banks a lot of this is very limited. There is some federal control. Even their control is not unlimited. I think that the best bet for California when it comes to mortgages and banks and interest is to try to do what Newsom has been doing and try to work out agreements with the banks. You know, it's actually not in the bank's interest to have these properties foreclosed on. It may be in the interest of Blackstone and some of those kinds of more predatory purchasers, but it's not in the bank's interest. So trying to work with the banks so that they are better about working out terms with their borrowers is something that I know that we can try to do at the state, and we should do. Now, I believe that we should have a rent freeze statewide. You know, I have pushed my cities to look into that, to doing a rent freeze so where nobody can increase the rent for a certain amount of time. And I believe Glendale has enacted that as an ordinance to their credit, and just said, listen, there's no rent increases right now until X amount of time. I think that's the least we can do. Everyone was very anxious to get this $2 trillion out the door in the federal government. And I get that. But at the same time, we weren't able to really weigh in, as the public. We weren't able to say, hey, what about looking at doing more what Europe's doing and doing less corporate bailout and paying part of people's salaries for the next couple months so that people are still getting an income instead of just cutting everyone this one check, which, is nice, but it's not going to do it for people in high rent areas. $1,200 is great if you're living, in Lodi, but if you're living in Los Angeles, that's probably not even half of 1 month's rent for a family. So, doing that blanket across the country really creates sort of winners and losers and isn't offering nearly enough relief in our high rent areas. So I think we need to do more. And I do know that the Assembly Banking Committee is trying to look at this up ways and down ways and sideways to see what we can do. And people are in active conversations with the banks at the same time. But if we could legislate some of these fixes, we would try to, but my understanding is that we're pretty limited in what we can do in terms of banks with their mortgagees.
Yeah. Let's ask about another question that I did a show about the other day, which is the powder keg situation that our state's jails, prisons, and immigrant detention centers are in right now. They're in forced close confinement. They cannot do physical distancing. The conditions are very unsanitary. I found out that at prisons, you can't even have hand sanitizer because it's got such a high alcohol content. And Rikers Island, is exploding with cases. The sheriff here in Los Angeles was able to release about 600 of their 17,600 prisoners. Really, what these organizations that advocate for these vulnerable communities are calling for is clemency. The governors, like Governor Newsom and Governor Cuomo, can give clemency to some of these prisoners that are in there for either nonviolent offenses, or they only have a few more years of their sentences, or they're elderly, or they have underlying health conditions. Would you be in favor, and could you urge the governor to grant these clemencies so that we don't have thousands of people dying in our jails, prisons, and detention centers?
I would say yes, and home confinement and supervised parole for people that are not dangerous, and certainly for the elderly population, is something we should be doing anyway. Given the fact that these long prison terms are not shown to actually help with recidivism. A lot of these people do not pose a public health threat at this point. They're extremely expensive to house, and we should be working towards finding ways of returning people, to the community and to society, rather than, just generally trying to turn them into better criminals, which is usually what our criminal justice system has been very good at doing, and not so good at finding ways of bringing people back into the community, and also not particularly effective at deterring crime, which is really, as a citizen, something that I'm very concerned about. Is I want less crime, and it's not shown that these long prison terms necessarily does that, which isn't to say that people shouldn't have deterrence and people shouldn't be punished when they commit crimes, but I think there are smarter ways of doing it, and other countries have led the way in ways of doing that, and really turning people's lives around and making them more productive and members of the community again. But right now, we also have a situation where we have a pandemic that's about to run loose in our prisons, and we have a responsibility as well, because they're in our custody, to protect these people.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not an expert and I can't tell you exactly how to do that, but we've got to be able to shift resources to provide sanitary and much more protective housing for people that we're not going to release. And whether we send people home for home confinement and then bring them back at some point, I mean, there's got to be ways that we can think out of the box to do that, because people go to prison to do their years. They don't go there to die of a disease. And we have a responsibility to offer them the kind of medical care and the sanitary situations that they have, that to protect them and to show that we value them still as human beings. You know, these are people that are eventually going to come back into our community. These are people that have children, that have families. And so we certainly have to do better. And I'm glad that the LA Times and the press has raised the alarm about this.
Well, as a state legislator, what are you going to do tomorrow to try to get the ball rolling on a solution for this? I want to get one commitment from you out of this show.
Well, listen, I've been penning a lot of letters, as my colleagues have been doing, about rent, about protecting people. I will absolutely bring up the prisoners on our conference call tomorrow with the governor's office. You know, it's not like people don't know about these problems, and it's not as though people aren't looking at them. It's really a question of being able to shift priorities at a time of sort of scarcity of resources.
Yeah.
So I do think the alarm's been raised, and I know that the governor has been granting clemency, but we need to do it in a much bigger fashion. You know, 200 people, 300 people isn't going to make enough of a difference when you've got thousands of people who are incarcerated. I would think at the very least to get the hand sanitizer in now, to get the soap in now, to find ways of taking people maybe out of these crowded conditions and bringing them somewhere else where they can be separated to a safe distance, is something that we need to be doing like this week.
So yeah, the other population I'm concerned about are women and children that face domestic abuse in the home. With them being forced to stay home, what is being done? And with social, I don't know if social services, social workers are still making these visits, if this is considered an essential service. Do you? But if not, what can be done for these very vulnerable and endangered individuals?
A lot of us are very worried about this population, and the governor has called this population out a few times as well as being a concern. I had a conversation just today with the YWCA in Glendale, which runs a domestic violence shelter. They are still, their shelter is still open. The residents are there. They are still doing their intakes. They're doing a lot of telehealth conferencing now with people. They're trying to get the word out that people, that there are resources for people. And we've been trying to help, you know, sort of push that information out on social media, that all of the resources that protect domestic violence victims are there and ready to help. And there are still shelters available. Our local domestic violence providers will help anybody who needs it. If there's no room in their shelters, they will get a hotel room for them. They will find a place for them. So people shouldn't feel, if they feel that they're trapped, they need to reach out. And it may be that the police is going to be the first line for them to reach out to. But I'm very concerned about this population. And I'm also concerned, quite honestly, Lauren, about the long lines that I've seen at the gun shops that are still open in Burbank and Glendale. At the same time, when we have what we see statewide as a spike in domestic violence, to have first-time gun buyers out there buying guns when they're already scared, and they're buying guns because they're afraid. I just think is a recipe for disaster.
Can't they be closed down? I mean, those are certainly non-essential businesses if I've ever heard of them.
I have spent a number of hours this last week on this very subject. So the governor, in a question to a member of the press, I believe, said that it will be up to the sheriffs of each county to decide whether or not gun shops are essential in their county. So the sheriff of LA has decided that they are not essential, and he's ordered them closed. But he's also said that that only is in effect in the unincorporated areas or in areas that contract with the sheriffs. That if you are in a city that has a municipal police department like Glendale or Burbank, it's up to the police chiefs and the city councils in those cities to determine themselves whether or not the gun shops are essential. Now, unfortunately, the council for the county of LA, I think, released some kind of statement that they thought that gun shops might be essential businesses, which I would argue with, but I am not a lawyer. I mean, if they're supposed to be essential because they're protected by the Second Amendment, I would say, well, books are protected by the First Amendment, and so are movies. And we've shut down the movie theaters, and we've shut down the bookstores and the libraries. So there's still a limit to what we can allow in a health crisis. And we've closed other forward-facing retail establishments. So I personally don't consider them essential. And I've had county health tell me that they didn't think they were essential, but because there's this sort of statement, I guess, from the LA County Council, I think some of the cities are afraid to order them closed.
Well, I think the governor should order them closed. I don't think he should be passing the buck to the cities. That's what I think. I'm going to look more into this. Two final questions. One, Medicare for all. Gavin Newsom was elected and endorsed by the California Nurses Association because of his commitment to getting a single payer bill in California. Don't you think this kind of shows the urgency that we have to finally get single payer health care in the state of California after all these decades?
So what's interesting about this is that right now what people are looking to provide this really crucial medical interventions is the state, right? Everybody wants the state to provide testing, the state to provide equipment, the state to make sure that there'll be seen. Gavin Newsoms has an executive order that no one can be turned away from any medical facility if they think they have COVID. So it's really interesting that people are now pivoting to the state to help provide medical solutions. So I agree with you. I think that one of the kind of silver linings maybe, or one of the lessons that can come out of this is saying that really the entity that is best positioned to provide quality healthcare, in a lot of settings is going to be the state. And whether it's, you've talked about the VA before, people love the VA. The VA is a federally run single payer healthcare system. And nobody is saying at this point, oh, the VA is, awful. People are clamoring, people that have ability to get VA benefits love those VA benefits. So I do think that this is showing that there are holes in our current healthcare system, that our piecemeal for-profit healthcare system is so inefficient and so clunky and has left our hospitals and our medical providers really on threadbare budgets. We need to fix Medicare and make sure that Medicare works. And we need to find a way of fixing our healthcare system. What we need is real, true, universal healthcare for everybody. Who is everyone worried about spreading the virus right now? Homeless people, our undocumented population. This is a reason why everybody needs to have access to excellent healthcare. Every single person who is living here needs to be able to have healthcare coverage so that if they're feeling sick, they know that they can go to a healthcare provider and get treatment, because we are all only as safe as our least vulnerable person when it comes to disease. If anybody does not have access to care, we are all vulnerable.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons people are so concerned about the homeless and getting them off the streets for the first time, because now it affects them. So my final question is this. I was driving around traffic-free LA the other day, and it was just such a pleasure. So I was musing about how it could be a great opportunity to get all those infrastructure projects done, like, all the aging water pipes and sewer pipes and everything like that. And then I read the next day that Beverly Hills is doing just that. They're going to try to expedite the finishing of the metro line. And I saw that a hedge fund billionaire tweeted Trump that he should do a big stimulus program of roads and bridges and all the things that Bernie Sanders talks about, rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure. And it would put people back to work. They would be doing it outside when they are physically distanced. And I'm just wondering, is that anything that the state could consider during this period of time when we're all confined to our homes? Any state infrastructure projects that we want to get finished?
I think that along with the immediate response and just getting the health crisis under control and making sure we flatten the curve, the next big topic of conversation in Sacramento is going to be stimulus. And it's going to be exactly that. Can we use this stimulus to create jobs for those people who lost their jobs, but do it in a way that really helps everybody in terms of infrastructure spending? I would say green jobs, working on our clean energy infrastructure, and all of the other needs, recycling, and really trying to kickstart a lot of that through whatever spending we have on stimulus. Not every city has the financial ability when people are working from home, when they have a skeleton staff of sort of moving their own infrastructure forward. But I think that's absolutely right, that we need to really look at a lot of that. And you had said something in the beginning of this that I thought was really good, and I wanted to go back to it. Now I forgot what it was before the infrastructure part. Oh, I was going to say also, if you care about infrastructure, or even if you don't care about infrastructure and want to know why you should care about infrastructure, John Oliver several years ago did a great episode where his entire episode was about infrastructure. And I highly recommend it. And the highlight of it was that he had a movie called Infrastructure the Movie, where he had all of these movie stars, and it was like a fake trailer for a movie about infrastructure. But I recommend it because it really highlights how, what do the aliens destroy when they come to Earth? Like, what's the thing they go after? They destroy Hoover Dam, the Golden Gate Bridge. They destroy the infrastructure, and yet we've allowed our own infrastructure to be destroyed by benign neglect and by a lack of investment. And the traffic. So, there's a lot of us who for years have been really wanting the state to invest in alternative transportation, in transit, in active transportation, and making our roads safer. And here we have this moment where we have safer roads to some extent because we have less cars on them. And I'm hoping that people see how wonderful that is and how freeing it is for them to be able to now ride a bicycle to go a mile, to go to the grocery store instead of driving, maybe with less fear because maybe there's less people on the road. A lot of transit agencies are making transit free. In Glendale, the Beeline bus is free right now for people. What a great thing for us to be investing in is incentivizing people to now use public transportation, but also allowing people who are dependent on it, our students, our seniors, our lower income residents, to not be penalized by taking transit to and from work. So there's a lot that we're doing right now that hopefully will stick to some extent.
Okay, great. Well, I'm not going to ask you another question, but I'm going to leave you with one thought that I thought of while we were talking, and that's free broadband. With everybody being at home now and the internet being the way that we communicate to our citizens about all these programs and developments, poor people can't go to libraries anymore and get access to the internet. So it may be something you want to talk to the telecom companies about, what they could do in terms of providing some free broadband to people. I personally think that should be in the public sector. We've got Chattanooga, Tennessee, where they have city-owned broadband, and it's cheaper, it's faster. Businesses are locating there because of that. Anyway, that's just a thought. I'm going to let you go because I want to promote my upcoming shows, but thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Thanks for having me, Lauren. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Wednesday, I'm going to be having my friend John Mirisch, who is the mayor of Beverly Hills. I was going to have Megan Sally Wells from Culver City, but she just canceled out. So it's going to be John talking about how that city is dealing with the COVID-19 outbreak. And Thursday, I'm going to be having an author by the name of Robert Galbraith, who had an article today in Truth Out about Governor Cuomo, who everybody is saying has done such a great job handling this crisis in New York. But in reality, it's because of him that, as I mentioned earlier in this show, half the hospitals have closed in New York. And also he is foregoing $6 billion worth of federal aid because he insists on cutting Medicaid in this time of crisis. Medicaid, the government program that helps the poorest people. And this article that Robert Galbraith wrote was about how Cuomo has just put some guy from the Blackstone Group in charge of the COVID-19 response. So we just know what he's going to be doing with all that federal money that they're getting from Trump. So those are my shows for the next few days. I really hope that people tune in and share these shows. I am unable to promote them in Facebook groups because I'm still in Facebook jail. And yesterday I was prevented from sharing even in the 12 groups that I moderate. They didn't give me a reason this time, just can't do it anymore. So I really hope that you guys find this programming valuable, especially during this crisis, and that you continue to tune in, you continue to share my show. So until you see me again, keep fighting and stay home.